Okay, Mom, for my dorm, I'm thinking coquette meets poet core.
That sounds like a vibe. What do you need? And where do we get it?
Target. I already have everything on my mood board. A comforter, pillows, and a super cute floral lamp.
So you probably need a rug to tie it all together.
OMG, they have the perfect CMPC rug.
CMPC?
Coquette meets poet core.
Oh, okay. In that case, let's RTT.
Yeah, let's run to Target. You're getting it. Find your dorm inspiration and everything you need at Target.
This episode is brought to you by Adobe Firefly, the all-in-one creative studio with AI-powered image and video generation. Built for today's creative process, Firefly helps you generate, edit, and experiment fast. Because the asks aren't getting smaller, and the timelines? Woo, yeah, still tight. With all the best creative AI models in one place, Firefly brings your ideas to life. Learn more at adobe.com/firefly.
This is True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time. Week by week, you'll hear the true stories behind the operations that have shaped the world we live in. You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position? I'm Rhiannon Needs, and this is True Spies from SPYSCAPE Studios. The Great Escapers. Italy, 1943. In July, Benito Mussolini was deposed after 21 years of fascist dictatorship. In September, the new Prime Minister, Marshal Pietro Badoglio, signed an armistice with the Allies. But the war was a long way from over. Italy's one-time ally, Nazi Germany, was still very much in play.
After the armistice, it was frankly chaos in Italy. Nobody knew what the Germans would do, so the negotiations had taken place between the Allies and the Italians. And I think they both seemed to assume that Germany would withdraw behind the Alps, or at least further up into North Italy.
As it happened, both parties were dead wrong. The new Italian government woefully misjudged their former ally.
None of the politicians of the time had had much to do under Mussolini, because really he'd taken all the big decisions. They were out of practice at the art of politics. And it wasn't long before that became very clear. What should have happened was that the road through the Brenner Pass into Italy should have been closed and guarded. That didn't happen. Hitler quite wisely decided he wasn't going to give up Italy and just flooded it with troops.
Hitler's Wehrmacht swept through northern Italy, heading south. Meanwhile, Allied forces marched north.
So just before the armistice, the Allied forces had started moving into the foot of Italy. They took Sicily very quickly, moved into Italy in September, and it was their aim to move very quickly up the country, which would, they hope, had been neutralised by the armistice. They weren't expecting to meet Germans coming down, and what the Germans very sensibly did was string a line of defences coast to coast, south of Ancona. It was about 20 miles deep. It had mines, tank traps. There were aerial reconnaissance missions going on overhead, machine gun posts.
From behind an impenetrable lattice of defences, the Germans halted the Allied advance just above Naples.
Not least because soon after they were stopped in their tracks, winter came, which turned roads into mud and slush, and then obviously things became very cold, machinery wouldn't work, and they weren't expecting the Allies the tenacity of the German defence.
Initially, Italian forces were of little help. It would be over a month before Prime Minister Badoglio officially declared war on Germany.
Italians were told to take no action now against the Allies. They were wondering, well, what should we do with the Germans? You know, people who were our brothers in arms, and the Germans equally were wondering what to do with the Italians. Confused and ill-armed and ill-led, the Italians didn't really know what to do. And a lot of them, understandably in some ways, took off their uniforms and went home.
If you're finding any of this hard to follow, With 80 years of hindsight, just imagine being there.
So Italian prisoners of war camps held about 80,000 Allied prisoners. Most of them had been captured in the North African campaigns, and obviously the Allies had varying fortunes in the war in North Africa. After they were captured, they were shipped back to Italy to be held there.
When news of the Italian armistice arrived in September of 1943, some British POWs could taste freedom on the air.
Men were faced with, in some cases, a friendly commandant, anti-fascist, who was very happy to let prisoners go.
But counterintuitively, actually taking that opportunity, seizing that freedom, would mean defying a direct order from London.
As early as June in 1943, the senior officers in the prisoner of war camps had received an order from Whitehall, and that was that prisoners were to stay put once the war ended. They didn't want their rush forward, their rush up Italy by Allied divisions to be hampered by men rushing around the countryside willy-nilly, distracting everybody, actually. And I imagined they thought they would envelope each camp as they went up the country. That was obviously vastly over-optimistic.
Those German defensive lines really were something. And with liberation not forthcoming, some prisoners were happy to follow the order and wait the war out.
There were men who were weary, who felt they'd done enough for king and country, who were somewhat institutionalised by, in some cases, up to 3 years in captivity. Most of them had been 2 years in captivity. If they didn't have a map, they didn't know where to go. If they didn't know the language, how would they get along? And if they hadn't been prepared mentally and physically for this journey, they knew they wouldn't survive. If they hadn't stored food, how would they eat? And so that's why a lot of them chose to stay behind.
All of which is absolutely fair enough, but it doesn't make for a very interesting podcast. Luckily for us, thousands of men ignored the stay-put order.
Common sense was telling them to go. Common sense was telling them to take advantage. Every prisoner of war is told to escape when he can. Take advantage, go out of open gates or through a hole in the fence or jump over a fence and make your own way back to British lines where you can be of value again, a fighting man again.
And that's the stuff that stories are made of.
Hi, I'm Karen Farrington and I'm the author of The Great Italian Breakout.
Karen Farrington is an author who specialises in bringing forgotten voices back to the fore, with a particular focus on World War II. Her most recent book, The Great Italian Breakout, tells the stories of those Allied servicemen who escaped captivity and braved occupied Italy in a bid to make it back to safety. Some relied on their wits alone. Some, as you'll discover, had quite a lot of help. Those who lived ended the war with a new understanding of what spies call tradecraft and what they'd call survival. In this episode of True Spies, you're going to hear one of those stories. And, as an extra treat, we'll meet the crack military unit who made it their mission to find and exfiltrate wandering escapers to safety. How's that for value? So, without further ado, September 1943, Modena. Just outside a railway station, a cattle train grinds to a halt. Armed guards patrol a grassy siding, jackboots pounding the dirt. Now, look inside the carriage. Those aren't cows.
The Germans were very busy taking all Allied prisoners into stalags in Poland and Germany. So away from the front line, where Allied troops were fighting their way up.
One of the prisoners bound for the stalags, Germany's own POW camps, was Leslie Nat Nathanson, formerly of Camp 19 in Bologna.
Leslie Nathanson was a lawyer in London before joining the army in 1939, and he was caught in North Africa, captured and shipped to Italy, where he'd spent 2 years behind bars, and his friends called him Nat, so I'll call him Nat from now on.
Camp 19 had been an officers' camp, reserved for higher-ranking POWs like Nat.
Officers tended to have a bar and a wine allowance. They were not expected to work in any way. They had a better quality of accommodation and decent food. And the net result of all of that is that they were fitter.
Even so, Nat, unlike some of his fellow captives, hadn't attempted to defy the stay-put order.
It was in his mind, but he never saw the chance where he could escape. What he could see were well-armed German troops, which very quickly took over Bologna, obviously in the north of the country.
Those same troops had, eventually, swarmed Camp 19, which was how Nat began his long journey north, crammed into a cattle train. He knew that, should he reach his intended destination, it was unlikely that anything good would be waiting there.
Nat was Jewish, a proud Jew, and there's no doubt that he knew what was going on in Germany before the war broke out. And there's no doubt that he perceived extra risk for himself and other Jewish soldiers like him had they fallen into the hands of the Germans.
So far, he'd been lucky.
As it happened, the Germans paid no attention to his name, no attention to his faith. Who knows whether that would have come back to haunt him if he'd ever reached a German prisoner of war camp.
And so, Nat resolved to escape.
Could he jump from a lorry? Would he escape into a village, into a town? But the opportunity didn't present itself, and it only presented itself when he got to Modena, and it was at that stage he looked through a ventilation slit, and he saw that there were many opportunities to hide himself in what was actually quite a large railway station with lots of lines on it.
From the slit in the carriage, Nat spied a railwayman's hut,
with railwaymen sitting outside. And these railwaymen appeared to be beckoning to soldiers on the train. Come to us, we'll help you. Now, by this time, men like Nat were very suspicious of every Italian they met. Clearly they were the enemy, and they had met guards during their time in captivity who hadn't improved their view of Italians. So Nat was a bit sceptical, but he thought, well, I'm going to try and escape. That's my duty as an officer, to try and escape.
After all, what did he have to lose? And his window of opportunity was narrow. You see, while the train was idling, the guards were allowing some men to take comfort breaks, a kindness they'd lived to regret.
So he did like many others were doing. He grabbed a toilet roll and sauntered off the train, making it clear to a guard nearby that he was going to go to the toilet.
With impressive nonchalance, Nat approached the railwayman's hut.
The railway hut had a garden and fencing near it, and he actually got as far as brandishing the toilet roll, walking away, dropping his trousers, and then as soon as two guards who had marched towards each other and then turned their backs and marched away, at that point as they were turning, he rolled into the garden and tried to hide himself in undergrowth.
Covering himself in twigs, stones, and various other garden detritus, Nat tries his best to become invisible. And he wasn't the only one who'd taken his opportunity to disappear.
And he certainly knew he wasn't alone when a colleague called Bill Wiltshire said to him, "Quick, grab these," and threw a pile of clothes at him. This was a weird pile of clothes, a weird set of civilian clothes, a hat, a yellow shirt, that he would have to pull on while he was lying down over his battle dress that he was travelling in.
Nat inches towards the railwayman's hut, aiming for a window.
And he caught sight of himself in the glass and thought, do you know, I look a little bit like a railway worker.
It's not a perfect disguise. On average, Allied soldiers, especially well-fed officers, are noticeably larger than the locals. But any port in a storm.
Anyway, he was quite content with the way he looked, rolled in to the hut to find a lot of rather silent railway workers looking at him.
When he'd seen them from the train, the workers had been all encouragement. Not anymore. Nat began to wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake. Had he walked into a trap?
The phone rang and one of the men inside picked it up and started talking railways to the man on the other end of the line, and another one slipped out, and his heart went cold because he thought, is he going to alert Germans nearby, very close, that I'm here?
A few moments later, the worker returned.
The man who went out came back. with a railway hat, a railway coat, and, not to forget, a red flag, which was the absolute sign that you're working for the railways at the time. And when he came back, he offered Nat some water from a canteen, and he slugged it down and a cigarette, and he lit it quickly and started smoking.
All was well. For now.
He realised that the Italians thought he was a German out to trap them into helping him, and they would obviously see terrible consequences for such an act. When they realised he was a British Army officer who was desperate for a fag, thirsty, and pretty unsure of himself, they responded well to him and they helped him.
Meanwhile, a few hundred yards away, a man by the name of Gaston Rocci stands atop Modena newly built soccer stadium. Peering through his binoculars, he and a small circle of trusted companions watch with interest as Nat and his fellow escapees make their bids for freedom.
Seeing men dash in here, dash in there, he saw one man do a backflip over the fence and hide in undergrowth. Now, it's fortunate, although he was in fact a member of the fascist party, his sympathies didn't lie there. They lay with the escaping Allied soldiers, and he sent out men who were with him to help them.
Nat has no idea that help is on its way. Back at the railway hut, two of the railwaymen lead him outside. They hoist him over a low wall, rather clumsily, it has to be said. On the other side, two more Italians lie in wait. The men sent from the stadium. They pick him up and dust him off. Struggling manfully through the language barrier, they try to make Nat understand that they're on his side.
They were going to make their way back to the stadium and safety.
But Nat's anxiety is building by the second.
Nat had already spotted a German gun nest on the road on the back of a vehicle and was terrified that they'd see him. He'd been convinced that he looked like a railway worker. Now he wasn't so sure. Now he felt like he looked like an escaping Allied soldier.
Terrified at the thought of what might await him at the hands of the Germans, he makes a split-second decision and bolts.
He made a run for it, but both men flanking him grabbed his arms and pulled him back. No. Quietly done. Stay calm. We can do this together.
Mastering himself, breathing deep, Nat follows the men back to the stadium. Their fellow partisans quietly invite him inside.
And he found inside already 5 escaped Allied soldiers had already been taken there, and that operation to free the Allied soldiers from their hiding places in trucks and behind mounds of earth and in heaps was still going on.
As Nat takes in his new surroundings, his eyes light up. One of his fellow escapers is a man called Terry Muirhead, a friend from the camp. Nat's nerves might be shot, and the streets might be crawling with Wehrmacht. But at least he isn't alone. Still, there's no time to waste. Every second he spends here ups the chances of discovery. Time to move.
Nat and his friend Terry Muirhead were taken to a flat in Modena, and this was part of a network that was being kicked into shape now. It had always existed, but there'd never really been a call for it before. But now this network in Modena was getting underway, thanks to the men from the sports stadium. They were taken there, and they lived with a couple and his son. Now, they lived in a tiny room off the main bedroom, in what was effectively tenement housing.
This is close quarters living. Operational security is paramount.
They knew from their experience there almost immediately that they could hear conversations from flats above, flats below. The windows were often open, so they knew they wouldn't be able to talk loudly, if at all. They could only walk past windows if the windows were shut or the shutters were shut, because people knew exactly who their neighbours were. They knew exactly who lived where. And if they saw a tall, dark figure walking past the window, they would give away not only themselves, but their hosts as well.
And for the brave Italians who helped escaping POWs, the consequences could be dire.
And they already knew that for themselves, they'd be sent to a prisoner of war camp in Germany, but their hosts, they would probably be killed, certainly imprisoned and split up as a family.
But while many Italians risked life and limb to assist men like Nat and Terry, they couldn't rely on everyone to be so unselfish.
Their problems got more acute one morning when they heard a plane overhead, and they looked through the cracks in the shutters and saw a fluttering down of snow-like leaflets. And these were leaflets offering rewards dropped by the Germans to let the people of Modena know if they saw an escaped soldier or airman, they would get a reward.
The reward on offer came to about £20 sterling, a little over 800 in today's money. For the people of Modena, suffering the devastating economic effects of war, it was a tempting sum.
This was a real test of whether they would stay loyal to the network, to the cause they joined up. And people did betray other people.
Stories of such betrayals found their way back to Nat and Muirhead, sequestered in their tiny box room. As the days dragged on, the men lived as hermits. The boredom shot through with the ever-present fear of discovery. Denied their own agency, they knew that their fates relied entirely on the efforts of their Italian helpers.
It was common knowledge that men like Nat and Muirhead were trying to get out, and the network did all it could to facilitate escapes. It looked everywhere for help. It investigated whether planes could come in, Allied planes, and pick people up, or indeed whether submarines could come in.
But this was slow work. There were some tantalising glimpses of a solution to their predicament, but too often they came to nothing.
There was a rumour that they could get out by boat from one of the coastal ports, but there were huge risks attached to that. They didn't know, again, whether the fishermen that they were negotiating with were fascists, or whether they were anti-fascists and would genuinely help them. And it involved a lot of money, and money that they didn't have.
An escape by sea seemed increasingly unlikely, but there was another option. About 6 weeks into their stay in Modena, one of the Italian network arrived at their door with a letter, written in code. It had been sent by a contact on Italy's northern border in the mountainous Alps. The letter told the Modena network that it was now possible to take the furniture out of storage and have it removed home. The furniture in question was thrilled.
The Alps were the closest escape route for people like Nat and Muirhead in the north of the country.
The journey into neutral Switzerland wouldn't be easy, especially this late in the year. Nat and Muirhead would need guides, ones they could trust implicitly. Luckily, the Modena network wasn't above using leverage to ensure that trust.
Sometimes the way the network made guides cooperate was by holding their fascist past against them and saying you can redeem yourself here by helping Allied troops escape, and this will perhaps go to wipe out some of your past connections with fascists.
In a post-Mussolini Italy, past support for fascism was a very bad look, with potentially deadly consequences. If the guides knew what was good for them, they'd do their bit to help Nat and Muirhead. Though, of course, they couldn't do that until the men arrived at the border, and that was going to be an arduous journey in itself. Another day, another station.
The first step of the journey would be by train, and Milan, then as it is now, was the major railway route, the railway hub for the region, for the whole of Italy really, and that would be where they would go to.
Nat and Muirhead are on the move, shuffling through the very station they'd escaped from weeks earlier. They're accompanied by a couple of their Italian hosts, who keep a respectable distance from their charges.
The railways were still used by German officers and indeed sometimes by German troops being transported from station to station. There was clearly a risk being caught with someone who was an Allied escapee. So they travelled slightly separately, slightly at a distance at arm's length.
The group manages to board a train heading north without incident, thanks to some rudimentary tradecraft.
Muirhead and Nat would be slightly on their own in the carriage, small carriages at the time, of course, and they were given large newspapers to hide behind. When the large newspaper was held up for too long, then they would have to feign sleep so that nobody would involve them in conversation.
During their time in Modena, Nat had picked up a smattering of Italian.
He was at an advantage because linguistically Italy remained very divided, and he could claim to have come from a different part of Italy, and that might well get him out of trouble with his accent.
Muirhead wouldn't be able to rely on that excuse.
Muirhead was not a gifted linguist. He could only speak English, and so if anyone had involved him in conversation, that really would have been the end of it. So, hiding behind their paper, they sat it out.
As the train ground towards Milan, Nat and Muirhead kept their heads down.
The train was slow. Trains were often stopped. Obviously, the Allies were trying to ruin the infrastructure of Italy, occupied Italy, and were bombing railway lines.
They knew that the slightest slip-up could bring their torturous journey to a sudden end.
The railway lines were still clogged with trains going north with prisoners of war, heading for prison camps.
Eventually, they arrived in Milan, spending the night in a safe house before departing for the small alpine village of Domodossola. There, they were hosted by another one-time fascist, atoning for his sins.
And it was even more risky there that someone would talk to them and they would inadvertently be given away.
But the general atmosphere of wartime paranoia worked in the men's favour.
It was at a time when it was unsurprising if people didn't speak, because, of course, Italy was a divided country. Nobody knew who was friend or foe.
The journey to Domodossola had been taxing, but whatever mental toll their journey had exacted so far would pale in comparison to the physical test to come. Unless you're a certain type of person, climbing a mountain is no fun at the best of times. Imagine doing it after 6 sedentary weeks of house arrest, and that as a coda to months behind bars.
The trek ahead of Nat and Muirhead would be exhausting. It would take every ounce of their self-discipline, their energy, their muscle power. It was like nothing they'd encountered before.
And as any mountaineer will tell you, the right wardrobe is a must. As they began their journey on foot to Switzerland, Nat and Muirhead learned that lesson the hard way.
They had heavy coats. This was to help disguise themselves on the train, to make them look like normal commuters or travellers. What they didn't have was proper footwear. Now, there was a good reason for this. They had, in fact, been taken in by the Modena network, still wearing their British Army boots, their strong, robust, grippy boots. But of course, anyone travelling that journey wearing British Army boots would have instantly been spotted for what they were, as an escapee. So they'd had to swap those out for what were effectively brogues. They were going to climb the Alps in brogues.
Luckily, they wouldn't have to do it alone.
They did have a guide with them, and this was very often the difference between success and the failure that haunted, I'm afraid, an unknown number of men who tried to escape through that route. Their guide, he was an older man, much older than them, but fit, very sure-footed, used to where he was going. When they got beyond the snow line, he carried on going forward, and they tried to step into his footprints to make life a bit easier for them. But if they strayed off the paths where the guide just had gone to one side, they went slightly to the other, they could fall into snowdrifts several feet deep. They were finding themselves going up steep slopes, rocky climbs, scree-covered slopes. As they got higher, the snowdrifts got worse. It was coming into November now. Winter was beginning to close in. They were thirsty and they were hungry, and most of all, they were tired. Most people in Italy at the time, they drank water, but obviously also drank a lot of wine. It was homemade, it was ubiquitous. So when they stopped, they often had a bottle of wine, and I don't think that helped, honestly, their progress. What they longed for was to lie down for a nap.
The Alps were dotted with shelters, intended to house the guides and shepherds that worked their snowy slopes. One such shack was Nat and Muirhead's destination on that first gruelling day in the mountains.
Now, the guide, George, would have managed the trip in just a couple of hours, but it was after dark that they reached the refuge, because the men were so slow, so unaccustomed to these harsh surroundings, harsh conditions to climb in, and with slippy shoes on.
Day 2 was no more enjoyable. But eventually, they did pick up some extra company.
They had been joined by other people, Italians trying to make it to the safety of Switzerland. They finally reached a second hut.
By now, Nat was beyond exhausted. As slumber took him on the wooden floor of the hut, he was dead to the world. Until men, laughing, drinking. Nat's eyes cracked into a squint. Fire flickering across grey uniforms.
And he thought, oh no, I've been through all of this, and the Wehrmacht is going to capture me now. I've reached almost the final rung of my journey, and I'm going to go back into custody.
But there was something Nat didn't know. The Wehrmacht didn't have a monopoly on grey.
While they were still sleeping, the Swiss guards arrived at a refuge, built a fire, and Nat woke to be warm for the first time in several days, to see a glow of a fire, and to have a hot drink given to him by the Swiss soldiers.
One of Nat and Muirhead's Italian companions had alerted the Swiss military, who patrolled their side of the Alps and could be relied upon to lend a helping hand.
They accompanied him over the border, and he was safe into Switzerland, where British officers like him were accommodated in pleasant conditions and fed and could contact their loved ones at home. It was going to be a happy ending for Nat and for Muirhead.
As it turned out, the pair had unwittingly become the first British soldiers to make use of the Alpine escape route into Switzerland. They wouldn't be the last, and not everyone would be so lucky. So far this episode, you'd be forgiven for wondering what on earth the British government was doing to help men like Nat and Muirhead, stuck behind enemy lines in occupied Italy. In fact, the last we heard from London was the Stay Put order, which resulted in thousands of Allied POWs being carted off to German stalags. Well, worry not. They weren't sitting on their hands. In fact, they'd mustered up a force with the express purpose of helping Allied escapees after the Italian armistice. A force called A-Force.
It was probably unprecedented. I can't think of another time when a country being invaded was actually subject to so many prisoners on the run, thousands of them, especially at the beginning. And the Allied forces were aware of the issue, probably didn't really know what to do about it. There was no blueprint for this. And they tried many tacks before they arrived at A-Force. They tried sending the SAS in with some success, but the SAS had other work to do. It was the idea that forces employed to rescue escapees could be better employed elsewhere, that made the hierarchy believe there should be one force devoted to rounding up ex-prisoners of war, and this would be A-Force. It was part of the intelligence wing of the army, and it was a small force.
While A-Force did eventually admit Italian soldiers to its ranks, it was initially made up of unusually brave servicemen from across the British Empire. Men like Major Jock McKee.
He was an extraordinary man. He claimed he'd come from royal lineage, but wrong side of the bed, and he was as brave as any man that served in the Second World War. He himself had escaped in North Africa. He had proved just how hard-bitten he could be there by shooting 5 unarmed German soldiers who were trying to recapture him.
McKee was famed for his steely nerves, bordering on a total disregard for his own safety.
Hitler made an order in 1941 that said that commandos, men who were out of uniform, captured in occupied territory, would be killed straight away. For that reason, the men of A-Force had to wear full uniform when they were at work in Italy. So Jock McKee and his men would set off from the Italian coast where they'd been shipped in, dressed in full British Army uniform, carrying guns, through Italian towns, through Italian villages. Now, they weren't entirely stupid. If they saw a German unit ahead, they would melt into the countryside. But they were quite happy to take on fascist sympathisers and German soldiers that they met along the way. And they must have cut an extraordinary sight marching through the countryside in step. They'd let none of their standards, their British Army standards, slip while they were at work in Italy.
A-Force's job was to set up a series of safe houses across occupied Italy, forming a rat line to an extraction point.
They already had contacts in occupied Italy. Of course, that happened before the armistice in 1943, but they made enormous use of sympathisers. And the contadini, the poor people of Italy, are often cited as those who helped ex-prisoners of war, and they certainly did. They had very little, and they shared what little they had.
You can hear more about the kindness and courage of ordinary Italians in an exclusive subscriber-only debrief with Karen, coming soon. But wealthier sympathisers also played a role, using their resources to finance escape networks, like the one that spirited Nat Nathanson out of Modena. For A-Force, these blue-blooded comrades were essential to their mission.
They gave use of their estates, which meant there were houses in various parts of Italy and large houses with estate housing on and land on, in which they could hide 10, 20, 30, 50 escaped prisoners as they rounded them up to take them to a place of embarkation, to take them back behind the front line.
By December 1943, the Badoglio regime had declared war on Nazi Germany. So it was that Jock McKee and A-Force found themselves aboard an Italian torpedo boat churning through the Adriatic Sea. Their destination? Umbria, smack bang in the middle of occupied Italy.
There were several aristocratic families in the area that McKee was working in who cooperated with him, and he worked with their family members, and one of them was the Vinci family.
Zeno and Andriola Vinci were aristocratic anti-fascists who had form for sheltering Allied escapees in their well-appointed villa, not too shabby a base. But when A-Force arrived, after a long wagon ride through the Italian countryside, they discovered a fairly serious issue with their accommodation.
People like this were happy to offer their home and help to men like McKee, but they were also compromised and had to offer the same help, or were told to offer the same help, for German forces. And this is what happened in their big estate in Umbria. And Germans moved in, they moved guns onto the lawn, they moved men in great numbers into upper floors, and for some time the Vincis moved out, and then they moved back and moved into the lower floor.
But unbelievably, that didn't stop the Vincis or A-Force.
Beneath them in the basement, they left the back door open, and McKee knew that door was open, and he came under cover of darkness, obviously. This was a place of intelligence for A-Force and men like McKee, and it was disseminated from there.
Using the occupied Vinci villa as their base, McKee's men trawled Umbria for Allied escapees, somehow appearing to avoid detection by the German soldiers posted directly above them. Shh. Of course, it's possible that their efforts at stealth weren't entirely successful.
What was funny reading the lady of the house's diaries later, at the end of the war, before the Germans withdrew, the German officer in charge told them, "I know what's been going on here. Don't think I don't, because I do." And they were very taken aback to know that he had realised, we don't know for how long, that people were hiding out in the basement. People who he was at war with, but he was gentlemanly enough not to betray them.
While the idea of a clean Wehrmacht is controversial today, there were certainly officers who didn't entirely buy into Nazi ideology. A-Force and the men they were there to help had gotten lucky. But there were times when luck wouldn't be enough to see them clear.
McKee and his men were marching round the neighbourhood in Umbria, trying to find escapees and direct them in the right way towards home and in safety. While they were doing this, they realised that Christmas was coming. It was December, it was obviously colder. They were hard-working men, and they thought that they would treat themselves to a Christmas dinner, a goose.
Having requisitioned a goose from a nearby farm, McKee and his men realised that they had no way of cooking it.
So they took it to a trattoria that they happened on. They went in and the innkeeper, not perhaps happily, but certainly agreed to cook the goose for them.
Remember, A-Force were in uniform, but they hadn't been challenged yet.
They were chatting away. They spoke Italian or English, depending on the circumstances. And at this point, they were speaking Italian to each other, and they looked up and realised that most people were standing looking at them, and they thought, we've been rumbled here. And while one of the customers said to them, you're British soldiers, aren't you? One of the men said, no, in Italian, obviously. I'm from Austria, which is why my accent sounds strange to your ear.
Perhaps this gambit had worked before. This time, not so much.
While this was happening, McKee moved to the door and looked out and saw 3 truckloads of German and Italian fascists moving towards them down the road. He alerted his friends, there were 4 of them, and they moved to the door, making haste by now to move to the door, but without wishing to look as though they were being run out of the place. Easy does it, boys.
McKee led A-Force across the road from the trattoria, keeping a weather eye on their 6.
They had an Israeli-Palestinian monk called Gepner, and he looked up the road, saw 3 truckloads of soldiers coming towards them, just 4 of them. And he said, oh dear. They all burst into laughter. What an understatement.
Instead of melting into the countryside, A-Force turned to face the fascist mob.
And they were still laughing when they opened fire on the trucks and the inn as men came rushing out to join the fight on the side of the Germans.
Leaving carnage in their wake, A-Force beat a bloody retreat.
The Germans didn't pursue them. They made their way around a field, firing all the while, and then there was a field gully, and they ran through the field gully out of range, but were not chased. And one can only speculate that it's because the Germans felt there was a whole battalion of men there rather than just 4, by the blast of gunfire that they received, that they were at the wrong end of. It's not known how many men died that day, but the 4 from A-Force survived.
But there was someone on their tail.
As they were making their way through the field, still anxious about the Germans really not very far behind them, and presumably reorganising to come after them, a dog came bouncing up to them, barking, a small dog, quite cute, by all accounts. And McKee, although quite able to open fire on any number of men and kill them, was fond of animals. He quickly dismantled his binocular case and used the strap as a lead and started to run, with the dog happily running alongside them.
A storybook scene. Eventually, they came across a farmhouse whose owner sheepishly laid claim to the troublesome animal.
Yes, that's mine, and I do apologise for his behaviour. They got some food and drink there before they went on their way, leaving the dog behind.
It was time for this particular mission to come to a swift end. A-Force knew that soon the heat would be on. Time to extract themselves, and any wandering POWs they could lay their hands on in the process.
They managed to find their way to another stately home owned by a sympathiser who had 2 sons who fought with A-Force undercover.
Their welcome here was not as warm as it had been at the Vinci Villa. The lady of the house had never met McKee, despite her son's involvement with A-Force. Naturally, she was keen to establish that the men darkening her door were who they said they were.
Both sons looked rather similar, and McKee was shown photographs by this woman who was suspicious of him. And unfortunately, he got them mixed up. He got the names mixed up. They were both handsome and rather similar in appearance. So she held out even further against them.
Put yourself in this woman's position. Would you invite Jock McKee to stay?
He looked as though he was in the British Army, but she didn't expect to find someone in the British Army turning up on her doorstep late at night, and McKee suffering the slight injury from a bullet wound he received during the shootout She was alone in the house. Her husband had been arrested the week before, and that was because he'd put up a picture of Mussolini in their castle. Unfortunately, he'd put it up in a toilet seat as a frame and had been dobbed in for doing so and was presently in jail.
The risk to her safety was enormous, but eventually, A-Force persuaded the lady of the house to relent.
And she gave them shelter for the night.
The next morning, it was time to go.
2 of them went off the following day to get back overland through enemy lines because they had by this time worked out how they could do this safely. McKee and Gepner stayed with her for a little bit longer and did a bit more reconnaissance work in the countryside before heading back themselves.
A-Force exfiltrated without any further violence, and this wouldn't be their last mission. But despite their frequently cinematic outings, real results were hard to come by.
A-Force had limited success in returning numbers of men. This was partly getting communications out to the men awaiting rescue. The Germans were not daft. They knew what was happening. They knew that there were rescue attempts. They knew there were escaped prisoners haunting the Italian countryside. They were very able to cause havoc themselves, the Germans, by putting out false messages. So much so that eventually prisoners of war who stayed hidden, stayed in farmhouses, moved at night between safe houses, didn't know who to trust. The biggest rescue that A-Force pulled off was Operation Darlington 2, and even that was less than 200 men. It was a success, but really I think they would have preferred to got greater numbers out and managed to find greater numbers in the countryside.
As for Jock McKee, the very qualities that made him an excellent soldier sometimes made him an ineffective saviour.
After the armistice, thousands of soldiers escaped. They made that decision and were confident that it was the right one, but for some of them it quickly became apparent that they were going to be in great peril. They felt they'd given their all for king and country already, and they didn't really want to get shot up by Germans on a roadside now. When McKee encountered men like this, who he rounded up, took back through German strongholds into the safety of Allied lines, he was appalled by their behaviour. Some of them told him they just didn't want to go with him. They were too scared. It wasn't the sort of language that he was used to hearing, and it certainly was at odds with his own set of principles and morals. He very close to his own men. He worked in a close-knit team. He certainly saw nothing of that sort of taking one step back in his own team. They were giving their all for these men, trying to get them back to safety. And there they were, digging their heels in. He ended up having to fire into the air, threatened to kill men of his own nationality that were refusing to go with him. He wouldn't countenance cowardice in any way.
When the war was over, a relatively small number of men could thank A-Force for their freedom. Far more owed it to the ordinary Italians who stood up and did right by them. That was certainly the case for Leslie Nat Nathanson.
He never forgot the kindness of the Italians who helped him. After the war, the British government failed in the eyes of escaped soldiers like Nat to provide for Italians who were still struggling in poverty. Their country had been decimated by war, and promises of compensation were very much scaled back by a government which admittedly was struggling for money itself. To try and make up for this, Nat and others like him went back to Modena to build youth centres and places where young people could go so they didn't fall into crime, they didn't fall through the gaps in a nation that was struggling to get back onto its feet. And this they did.
I'm Rhiannon Needs. If you've enjoyed these stories, you can find unabridged versions, and many more besides, in Karen Farrington's book, The Great Italian Breakout. And do keep your eyes peeled for a bonus episode with Karen over on SPYSCAPE Plus. Join us next time for another rendezvous with true spies. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis.